I'm obsessed with truth and optimizing mental health, and for that reason, I meditate 2 hours every day. Today, I invite you on my rocky journey of neuroses toward transcending the ego, and to explore some of the rarely discussed traps of spiritual practice. This is the exact video that I wish existed before my pursuit of ego death to overcome anxiety. What I wish my meditation teacher would have told me. My name's Sam Roth, and if you're new here, I make weekly videos on science, spirituality, and psychology to help you optimize your mental health and make a positive impact in the world. So consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to receive updates when I release a new video. Now, I want to preface this video very importantly that I am actually speaking from my experience here. Spirituality is not one glove fits all. Okay, good? We've got that out of the way. This is my experience. Good. Okay, let's get into the video then. So some of you may know my story from my previous video, What I Wish My Therapist Told Me, and I'll link that up here, and I'll also link to it at the end of the video in case you want to watch that. I would highly recommend it. And in it, I talked about my story, and I just want to briefly recap my story for you so you can understand where I'm coming from. So I want you to imagine me coming home from a day at university of feeling socially anxious, of feeling contracted, and retreating to my room to play video games. I did this for 10 hours a day at its peak at some times, and I would just be sitting in my room trying to hide away from the difficulties of life, suppressing that anxiety that I was feeling. And I also struggled with things like workplace anxiety. I felt like an imposter, like I couldn't do my job effectively as a cardiac technician because I was so up in my head and contracted in these negative emotions and anxiety that was holding me back from actualizing my potential. And this actually led me to my first Vipassana meditation retreat. So after hearing from one of my idols, Tim Ferriss, that 80% of people of high-class performers have a mindfulness or meditation practice, and from Sam Harris, that he highly recommended sitting at least one meditation retreat in your life, I took it upon myself and I booked myself in for an S.N. Goenka 10-day Vipassana meditation retreat. So I walked up to the retreat, and before I knew it, the gong was hit. Dong! No talking to anyone. No looking at people in the eye, no reading, no writing, just completely with the mind. You learn the technique of Vipassana meditation, which teaches you on the experiential level that the reason that we suffer is because we crave for pleasant sensations and we have aversion. We don't want to feel negative emotions. We push them away when they arise. And this is actually what fuels our suffering, this craving for pleasant and aversion to unpleasant. And you're taught on the retreat that what is actually driving this at the root level is sensations in the body. So anxiety is simply just a manifestation of an unpleasant sensation on the body, and you will learn to not react to it. And the promise of this technique is essentially if you become so good at non-reactivity to the difficult emotions and also to the pleasant emotions as well, then eventually you can come to a place of equanimity, of non-reactivity, of a need to be free from unpleasantness and a need to experience pleasantness to be happy in life. Happiness without conditions. Now, what's unique about this technique is it teaches you a completely different model to Western psychology. Western psychology will tell you to deal with the content of your experience through basically like Jungian models of psychology, where if you feel an unpleasant sensation, okay, let's take a look at that. Let's look more deeply at the content of your experience. What's driving this anxiety? What's driving this anger? What's driving this sadness? Let's look at a childhood trauma. But Goenka's model basically says, ignore all that. We're looking at only the sensation. If we have any interest in transcending the ego, we need to let go of content and just deal with the sensations in the present moment. Now pay attention to that because I'm going to come back to this, and I think there is a better approach from my personal experience, so bear with me. It made complete logical sense. Do not react to the unpleasant, do not react to the pleasant, and find equanimity. It made so much sense. And Goenka, he radiates this loving kindness. You can't help but be infatuated and soak it up like a sponge in the video discourses that he presents at the end of each night.
You must observe yourself. Unless you observe yourself, you can't come out of this problem. This is a big problem for everybody.
You know, like the video, if you've done a retreat and you can relate to me, you gotta love the Goenka booming perfect equanimity. So I finished the retreat and I was infatuated with the technique. I understood now, right? I got it, that I had to be non-reactive and just continue practicing, which is exactly what I did. I meditated for 2 hours every single day because I saw clearly that it gets to the root cause of our suffering. But what I began to realize is that meditation isn't all sunshine. practice. I started to meditate a lot more, and I did 2 more 10-day retreats, really committed to the technique. And at these retreats, I reached a much greater depth of practice. But what you quickly realize with Vipassana meditation is the stiller and the deeper you go into the mind, the more unsurfaced and unprocessed content that you haven't dealt with in the past will resurface. Micro traumas that happened to you at a young age, macro traumas, like big significant events in your life that really sculpted your personality in a neurotic holding pattern or something, and suppressed emotions that you pushed down in the past, they tend to come up. And the promise is that it makes complete sense. Just continue to not react to these negative emotions. Continue to not react, and you will have equanimity and you will transcend the neurotic holding patterns. So in my case, what was happening was an almost like volcanic eruption of all of this anxiety and suppressed emotion that I hadn't processed and dealt with in the past, so much so that it was actually very destabilizing. Funnily enough, my teacher, S.N. Goenka, actually acknowledges this as a sign of progress. He explicitly says in the discourses that the deeper you go with meditation, sleeping impurities may arise into your experience. And it's a predictable part of the Theravada model of meditation practice. But what I found was, and what the Buddha has said, is what you repeatedly focus on becomes the inclination of the mind. What I found was, at the time, what the technique was actually doing for me was it was making me more heightenedly aware of these unpleasant sensations in the body. But what I was doing was I was actually still being reactive, although I thought I was being non-reactive. I was with a sensation of anxiety, of discomfort, in order for it to go away, as opposed to having non-reactivity to it. So you can imagine this was a bit of a downward spiral for me. Heightened awareness of discomfort, which actually magnified the anxiety, while all the while being reactive. So I'm spiraling down, I'm becoming more reactive to the unpleasantness, which actually fueled more anxiety. Now, this is actually very common. In Zen, it's called Zen sickness. In the Progressive Insight and the Theravada model of meditation, it's called the stages of insight in the Dukkha. And in Tibetan, it's called Nyams. These sorts of difficulties are very common, which I actually talk about in way more detail. In case this is ringing true for you and you want to understand it more deeply, watch this video here on meditation in the dark night of the soul. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The latter procedure, however, is disagreeable and therefore not popular. Carl Jung. So my practice continued like this for some time. While I was making progress in various other aspects of meditative and spiritual development, I couldn't deny the fact that the anxiety that I was feeling was indeed worsening, and I didn't have the tools to be able to deal with it. It was permeating outward into areas of my life where I felt like I was losing my capacity to connect more deeply with people, to do work, and just feeling very, very scared and contracted in my day-to-day life. And despite my best efforts to be non-reactive, despite meditating 2 hours every day, listening to meditation talks, Dharma talks, all sorts of things, I still struggled to integrate and be non-reactive to these really difficult, unpleasant sensations. I understood the theory that I shouldn't be reactive, but in practice, it was one of the hardest things I could do. In Jungian terms, meditation was bringing the darkness to the light, but a bit too much darkness that I could handle without dealing with the content. Remember, S.N. Goenka and the technique of meditation teaches to not deal with the content, but I felt like it was time for me to start dealing with the content, because until this point I had neglected it, which was actually inhibiting my capacity to go deeper in meditation. Recently I did a men's retreat, and what I discovered was something quite remarkable from this retreat. This men's retreat strictly looked at dealing with the content that arose in my experience. So previously, where I had neglected it through just doing mostly Vipassana meditation, with some psychological work permeated in there, what this retreat showed me is that there are a lot of other men who have a lot of messed upness in them as well, that I could find relatability, and that my ego, that myself, was actually okay just the way it was. And it also showed me that I have all of these energies within me that were untapped through not dealing with the content of what was arising in my experience. You know, I have a warrior in me, someone who can attack and get after it and do things in my day with a ruthless amount of energy and attack mentality. I have a magician in me, or wise sage who knows to integrate wisdom to overcome suffering and to make a positive impact in the world. I have a lover, a compassionate side in me, someone who can open their heart and speak their truth to other people in vulnerability. And I have a king in me as well, someone who can be a father and a leader. What my experience has shown me is that from the integration of more psychological work of building a healthy ego before you transcend the ego, it leads to much greater spiritual outcomes. Because when you develop a healthy self, there's less of a tendency to need to contract into neurotic holding patterns. It's much easier to go a lot deeper in meditation to access the vast spacious awareness that encompasses all of us. Because if you're not contracting into negative emotion like I was for so long, despite meditating for prolonged periods of time of 2 hours a day, you're more readily able to access these heightened states of meditative and spiritual development, whether that's deeper Vipassana meditation or deeper non-dual meditation practice. So as an analogy, I like to think of it like this. You can be a fully awakened being, someone who has realized the truths of their experience, that there is no self, that they're impermanence, and they've integrated all these spiritual teachings through a dry insight model of not dealing with the content. But underneath that is Windows 97 hardware, right? Like an old operating system of an underdeveloped and unintegrated self. But when you do work like I did with a men's retreat, for instance, and you integrate the aspects to your psyche, it gives you a much easier platform to bounce off to transcend the self, so that you can access these deepened states of spiritual practice a lot more easy, having integrated the self earlier on in the process. So I think from my experience that the ego needs to be seen in order to be unseen. The ego needs to be acknowledged and integrated for what it is before you can transcend the ego. It needs to be seen in all of its fucked upness. You need to know that you have all of these shadow aspects to your ego, all of these beautiful aspects to your ego, and to experience them and to abide in them in a process of integration through psychological work, or men's retreats or women's retreats if you're a girl watching this, all sorts of practices of integrating the psychology. And there's lots of models that have shown this. You know, Ken Wilber's wake up, clean up, grow up model. Richard Rohr's developing a healthy self before transcending the self. There are a lot of contemporary lineages of spiritual practice that acknowledge the fact that you need a healthy self before you transcend the self. So I wish my teacher, S.N. Goenka, emphasized the importance of dealing with the content. I think not dealing with the content is an ultimate reality that we have to come to. You know, there comes a point where if you continue to deal with the content, you're not going to become fully awakened, which I think S.N. Goenka's teaching acknowledges. But on the earlier stages of the path, to deal with this more intense content that may arise from the depths of your psyche, from doing deep meditation practice, I believe from my experience and what my experience has shown me is that by working through the content actually gives you a much more of a greater platform to bounce off so you can transcend the self, which is really the crux of this video. Develop a healthy self so it can be transcended. If you like the video and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this one. If you like this one, you might like the video that I did on what I wish my therapist told me, which you can click on now up here to watch that now, and I'll see you over there, guys. Much love. Thank you for watching this video. I'll see you in the next one. Adios.